Greetings and welcome to everyone for the second session of the 13th edition of the South Asia Conference. On behalf of the Director General MP-IDSA, I extend a warm welcome to the Chair, our esteemed speakers, guests, and all participants. The theme of this session is Perspectives on Afghanistan and will be chaired by Ambassador Ashok Sajjanhar. Ambassador Sajjanhar, member, MP-IDSA Executive Council, was a career diplomat of the Indian Foreign Service and had a distinguished career over 3 decades. He was the Ambassador of India to Kazakhstan, Sweden, and Latvia. He negotiated for India in the Uruguay round of multilateral trade negotiations for India-EU, India-ASEAN, and India-Thailand Free Trade Agreement. He has worked as the head of National Foundation for Communal Harmony. He is a strategic expert who writes and speaks on issues relating to international relations and Indian foreign policy. I now request Ambassador Ashok Sajjanhar to chair the session and conduct the proceedings. Over to you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sindhu. Thank you for this gracious introduction. And let me also at the outset convey my deep appreciation to Director General IDSA, Ambassador Sajjanhar, for this invitation to chair this session. It's a great pleasure to be here and to be in the midst of such a galaxy of speakers. We have about 2 hours in our second session on the first day today. And the theme of the session just now is Perspectives on Afghanistan. We have 4 speakers for the session, and the addresses of all the speakers will be followed by discussion and question answer session. Before I invite the first speaker to take the floor, let me share just a few very brief thoughts in terms of bullet points as to what is the situation that we see in Afghanistan and how do we see it panning out going forward. So the first point that I'd like to make at the beginning of our session is that as of today, it's exactly 4 months since Taliban came to power. It wrested power. It came into Kabul without any opposition. And over the 10 days, 12 days before that, they overran the whole country. So it's 4 months and 1 day. And there is not a single country in the world that has recognized it, that has given it diplomatic recognition so far. There is some engagement of some countries with the Taliban dispensation going on. There have been visits of delegations. Taliban has also been speaking to a large number of countries from Doha and elsewhere. But so far, no political, no diplomatic recognition has been given to the Taliban setup that is in Kabul. The second aspect is that the Doha negotiators, Mullah Ghani Baradar, who used to be going all over the country, whether we saw him before in the earlier months of this year, whether and previously, whether he was in Doha, he was in Tehran, he was in Moscow, he was in Beijing, and his right-hand man, Sher Stanekzai, they are nowhere to be seen. All of them have been sidelined. So they have been replaced by some other people who are heading the caretaker government in Kabul. Thirdly, this appears to be, of course, the Taliban did say that Taliban 2 is going to be very different from Taliban 1 of 1996 to 2001. It seems to be, of course, different in more ways than 1. The most obvious difference appears to be that while the T1, Taliban 1, was a very unified structure under the rule of Mullah Omar, this is a highly faction-ridden organization. And there have been too many stories that have been going around. I will not go into it. I'll not delve into it. But just to keep in mind that the Taliban of today is not, it's not a homogeneous organization. It's not a unified organization body. It is a highly faction-ridden body. The next point is that today we have a large number of terrorist groups that are operating from the territory of Afghanistan. In the during the first incarnation of the Taliban at the head in Kabul. Also, we did have Al-Qaeda and some of the others. But the number seems to have grown much more, seems to have mushroomed. It's not only the ISIS Khorasan province, it's not only Al-Qaeda, it is not only Jaish, Lashkar, the Islamic movement of Uzbekistan, the Ansarullah, Jamaat Ansarullah, East Turkestan Islamic movement. You could go on and on. So there are a large number of them who over the last 20 years have worked along with, have fought along with the Taliban. So going forward, I think how Taliban is able to deal with them and how they are able to, what is the sort of environment that is created. I think that is something that we will have to look at. The next point is what I think everyone was fearing around the end of August when the Americans were leaving, when the NATO forces were leaving, that there is going to be a huge exodus of refugees from Afghanistan. Well, in the initial few weeks, there was a lot of clamoring, there was a lot of noise, but otherwise, we don't seem to have seen very much of refugees that are coming out of Afghanistan. And maybe the last point that I'd like to make here is that maybe in the initial weeks, we saw a lot of toing and froing in around the region. Let us say into Islamabad, there were foreign ministers, there were secretaries coming into having discussions how to deal with the whole matter in terms of the instability. There were also ministers coming into Central Asian regions, but that and also into Doha to have discussions with the Taliban set up there. But that seems to have come down quite a bit over the last few months. So this is what we see, what used to be on the front pages of international newspapers and headlines in TV programs. Afghanistan has moved out of that to some extent. So, but not to say that the challenge has come down in any way, because what we saw right from the beginning in terms of the need of having an inclusive government, in terms of ensuring that rights of minorities are protected, women, girls, children are protected, that Afghan territory is not used for terrorist purposes, etc., etc. There were a large number of concerns. All those concerns are still very much there. So this is the lay of the land as we meet for our session today. And as has been mentioned, the theme is perspectives on Afghanistan. What I see from our speakers, a very eminent lineup of speakers, that it is, we are going to be focusing much on Central Asia. We'll be focusing on the US policy towards Afghanistan and possibly towards the region also. And then we have another speaker who will be speaking about in general about the security crisis, Afghanistan security crisis and the region. So I will invite the speakers as they appear in the schedule in the program. So first, let me give the floor to Mr. Michael Kugelman. In fact, all the four speakers are extremely well known. None of them really needs an introduction, but just to refresh our memories, let me say a few words about each one of them. Mr. Michael Kugelman, he is the Asia Program Deputy Director and Senior Associate for South Asia at the Woodrow Wilson Center, where he is responsible for research, programming, and publications on the region. His main specialty, Pakistan, India, Afghanistan, and US relations with each of them. Mr. Kugelman writes monthly columns for Foreign Policy's South Asia channel and monthly commentaries for War on the Rocks. He also contributes regular pieces to the Wall Street Journal's think tank blog. He is the editor or co-editor of 11 books he has written for the New York Times, Foreign Policy, Foreign Affairs, and other publications. covering topics ranging from US policy in Afghanistan to terrorism to water, energy, and food security in the region. And Mr. Kugelman's, the title of his presentation is going to be The Future of US Policy in Afghanistan. So, Mr. Kugelman, you have the floor, maybe about 15 to 20 minutes, because we have 4 speakers, 2 hours. So that should 15, 20 minutes each of the speakers. That should leave us some time for Q&A at the end. Mr. Kugelman.
Well, thank you very much, sir, for the kind introduction. I trust that I'm audible to all.
Indeed.
Thank you. Thank you to IDSA for the invitation to participate in this conference. I fondly recall several past visits I've made to your institute, and I hope to be there in person at some point not too far down the road. But for now, it's a pleasure to be part of this conference and this panel. So indeed, I've been asked to speak on the future of US policy in Afghanistan. The focus here will be on US objectives and interests in Afghanistan post-withdrawal. But before delving into that, it may be useful to provide one important item of historical context. I would argue that US policy in Afghanistan had long been on a trajectory of retrenchment and retreat. President Biden's decision announced in April 2021 to withdraw did not come out of nowhere. We need to go back, ironically, to President Obama's decision in 2009 to surge troops into Afghanistan as the point at which US policy in Afghanistan began to focus on an endgame. Obama announced the surge in troops, but at the same time, he announced a phased withdrawal of troops. And indeed, US troop numbers at their high water mark in 2010 and 2011 would slowly decrease in the years after that. And in 2014, the US formally ended its combat war and transitioned to a training and advising mission in Afghanistan. President Trump was never comfortable staying in Afghanistan. He announced a policy in 2017 that entailed staying and even adding about 1,000 US troops or so in Afghanistan, but he really wanted to leave. And that is why he charged Zalmay Khalilzad with negotiating what I think can best be called a withdrawal deal. And it certainly was a flawed deal, but it was a formal agreement, and President Biden decided to honor it. And that brings us today. So future US policy in Afghanistan is all about post-withdrawal, but we've seen US policy gradually moving toward the withdrawal phase for quite some time. So I'll briefly speak about future US policy in the near term, midterm, and longer term. US policy in the near term is very simple. The US has 2 chief goals, I think. One is helping or trying to help remaining US citizens as well as Afghan citizens with SIV status get out of Afghanistan. And second, making efforts to address this terrible and worsening humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan. Neither of these plans is going very well. As I think we all know just from media reports, there are many people in Afghanistan that want to leave, that still want to leave but can't. There are folks that have gotten to another country but are having trouble getting to the country they want to end up in. US assistance efforts in this regard have often been unorganized and even chaotic. On the humanitarian assistance front, we all know that things are not going well at all. The US, of course, imposed sanctions on the Taliban government after it came to power, and this badly exacerbated a terrible economic and humanitarian crisis. And there are currently a lot of discussions going on within the administration about how to do its part to avert famine and starvation in Afghanistan. The administration certainly recognizes that simply providing humanitarian relief is not enough to save the country from economic collapse. But my sense is that it does not yet have a formal plan. It's still in a consulting and deliberating phase. Many conversations, but no finalized policy. And one of the major constraints for the Biden administration is what it perceives to be the political risks of ending sanctions or unfreezing frozen assets and allowing them to flow into a country controlled by the Taliban, and especially the Haqqani faction. My sense is that if the Haqqanis didn't have so much power in this Taliban government, then maybe the US position may be a bit different. But at any rate, there have been many analysts and scholars in recent weeks that have proposed a series of middle ground options that go further than simply providing humanitarian aid, but fall short of actually outright ending sanctions and unfreezing all of those frozen assets. For example, there have been calls from many outside the government for releasing some funds in order to bring relief in critical areas that would not benefit the Taliban directly. And this includes providing funds to reputable Afghan banks to ease the liquidity crisis, to provide funds to public servants to pay their salaries, especially in the health and education sectors, to critical infrastructure like roads and bridges that enable basic service delivery, and so on. And I imagine the administration will strongly consider some of these options. But the bottom line is that the humanitarian crisis is just going from worse to even worse. Why have things not gone well with these U.S. efforts to help with evacuations and ease the humanitarian crisis? I think that clearly a big reason is that the administration is still recovering from the shock of the Taliban taking over before the withdrawal was complete. That set in motion a stressed, chaotic, often chaotic policy response that is still trying to gain more coherence. But at any rate, in the immediate term, the U.S. will engage with the Afghan government, but it will, with the Taliban government, but it will not recognize it formally. I think the U.S. has made that quite clear. The U.S., like most other countries, knows that you can get a lot done with the Taliban and engage in talks and so on without having to recognize it. Senior U.S. officials have met with and negotiated with the Taliban multiple times since August 15th. And since its immediate goals are narrowly focused, it doesn't need to be ambitious in its relations with the Taliban. It doesn't need to recognize it, and it won't. So now shifting to U.S. medium-term policy, what we can perhaps look for. The short-term goals I mentioned will continue, but I think you'll start to have in the coming months more of a focus on this so-called over-the-horizon counterterrorism capacity. My sense is that this goal has taken a backseat to the humanitarian issues, but it will become more of a focus later on. And I think this is another area where the U.S. will really struggle. There are no known new deals that the U.S. has concluded with any neighbor of Afghanistan related to counterterrorism cooperation, no agreements to base troops in these countries, no new intelligence sharing accords to help the U.S. monitor terrorist movements in Afghanistan. There may eventually be a deal with Pakistan that formalizes something that's already been happening for quite some time, and that is continued U.S. overflight rights over Pakistani airspace. But the U.S. has not been able to generate viable alternatives to its de facto and rather undesirable, less than ideal plan, and that is to use existing U.S. military bases in the Middle East as staging grounds for U.S. counterterrorism activities. This is not ideal. These bases are far from Afghanistan. Counterterrorism operations can't be all that efficient when the assets are so far, when counterterrorism assets are so far from the target area. And even worse, as things stand now, U.S. military assets, particularly aircraft, would need to fly around Iran, where the U.S. does not have overflight rights to get over to Afghanistan. So for these reasons, some critics have joked that this over-the-horizon capacity is really more of an over-the-rainbow capacity, meaning it's not going to succeed. And even now, nearly 4 months after the U.S. withdrawal, there has not been a single known U.S. drone strike or other airstrike in Afghanistan, and I think that's significant. Now, finally, getting to U.S. longer-term policy in Afghanistan. Of course, this is very murky right now. It's very hard to predict. But I'll make a few observations that can perhaps provide some context for thinking about what to expect in the coming months and years, for that matter. First, the Biden administration has made very clear that its biggest priorities lie elsewhere, outside of Afghanistan. Biden himself has indicated that he decided to withdraw in great part to be able to focus on what he feels to be more important issues: climate change, competition with China. So this suggests in time that we could see U.S. engagement in Afghanistan start to diminish. And certainly I think it will continue to be active diplomatically to an extent, but on the whole, I anticipate a slow and gradual disengagement in the longer term, with its main contribution limited to diplomacy, and we don't know who that interlocutor could be in the long term. This is another issue. The Taliban may well not stay in power for a long period of time. The U.S., I think, will also continue to focus on its over-the-horizon counterterrorism capacity to the extent that that endures. A second point, which I'll make, which sort of flows from the first one, gets to U.S. strategic considerations. The top U.S. foreign policy concern in the long term, as it is now, is competition with China. This means that U.S. policymakers will look at the world through the lens of U.S.-China rivalry. And this has prompted some commentators, especially those who oppose the U.S. withdrawal, to come up with a narrative that goes like this. Leaving Afghanistan is a bad idea because China will step, and Russia for that matter, will step into the vacuum left by the U.S. and become a prime actor in Afghanistan. I'd argue, however, that Afghanistan is not really a big battleground for U.S.-China rivalry. The U.S. and China have cooperated on Afghanistan more than they have competed on it. They're both part of the Troika Plus, arguably the most influential of the Afghanistan-focused regional diplomacy efforts. On many levels, they see eye to eye on Afghanistan. They want more stability, they want less terrorism, they're wary of the Taliban, but they're willing to engage with it, and so on. And so this is another reason why the U.S. has really left Afghanistan for good, in my view. The China factor will not tempt it to come back because competition with China is not a thing in Afghanistan. I should say as well, China has actually been very cautious about Afghanistan. It has held back. It's provided a modest amount, or it's announced a modest amount of humanitarian assistance, but not that much, significantly less than what the U.S. has offered. China was a cautious actor even over the last 20 years. It has some economic assets in Afghanistan, but it has not been really present because of security concerns. So China will likely be looking for more security assurances before it tries to get more, before it tries to scale up its influence in Afghanistan. Third point relates to counterterrorism. This is the lens through which the last few U.S. presidents have viewed Afghanistan. Trump decided to stay in Afghanistan in part because of the need to target terrorists. Biden decided to leave Afghanistan in part because he concluded that the threat of terrorism to U.S. interests was not sufficiently strong to warrant U.S. forces staying, even though, of course, 13 U.S. soldiers were killed in a terror attack there in late August. So considerations of counterterrorism will continue to guide U.S. thinking long after the withdrawal. For the U.S., the chief goal of over the horizon is to preempt terrorist threats to U.S. interests, and there is a key distinction to be made here. The U.S. is not maintaining a counterterrorism capacity to try to reduce terrorist attacks in Afghanistan or even cross-border terror attacks in Pakistan or Iran or Central Asia. That's not the main priority. Its top priority is to prevent Afghanistan from becoming a place, again, where attacks can be plotted that target U.S. interests and especially U.S. soil. And there's currently no indication that Al-Qaeda or Islamic State Khorasan, the two main international terror groups in Afghanistan, currently have the capacity to plan and carry out an attack on U.S. soil or even far beyond Afghanistan. So for the U.S., over the longer term, the idea is to make it impossible for terrorists to acquire the capacity to carry out longer range attacks that can strike U.S. interests or soil. And in this vein, and I'll wrap up here, I'm often asked if there is any chance that the U.S. could, quote, go back to Afghanistan, with the question implying a return of U.S. military forces and assets. I think it's unlikely. If the Taliban regime were to collapse and there's a resurgence of civil war, that would not bring U.S. forces back. If you have increased terror attacks in Afghanistan, that won't bring U.S. forces back. But if the U.S. were to ever conclude that there is credible evidence and intelligence suggesting that terrorists are using Afghanistan to plot an attack on the U.S., that could well bring back some type of air campaign or other operation to try to degrade or eliminate that threat. So the takeaway from these observations about potential long-term U.S. policy in Afghanistan is that Washington is going to be driving faster and faster until Afghanistan is in its rearview mirror and then disappears from it altogether. We're likely to see the U.S. increasingly less engaged in Afghanistan in the long term, with counterterrorism concerns the main thing, keeping U.S. officials focused on the country. So with that, I'll wrap up and look forward to the discussion later on.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kugelman. I think that's immediate, medium-term, long-term perspectives you have provided on U.S. policy. And I think you have tried to answer several questions, but they have raised many questions also. But I think we'll come to that in the discussion in the question answer session after all the presentations have been made. Now let me invite Dr. Nilofar Sakhi, She is a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. She's a scholar and policy practitioner who has written extensively on various aspects of transnational security and human security, peacemaking and peace-building processes. Her recent book is on human security and agency, reframing productive power in Afghanistan. Her thematic expertise is political violence, security, and geopolitics. Her regional expertise is on South Asia, Iran, and Afghanistan, with focus on regional security architecture. She's been involved in developing strategies and programs for women in politics and economy in Afghanistan. Dr. Sakhi was or I don't know whether you pronounce it as Sakhi, because that's a name in, that's a word in Hindi, and that's a very nice, epithet. Dr. Sakhi was the founder of first women's civil society organization and the first radio station for women in the western zone of Afghanistan. And you'll be speaking on Afghanistan's security crisis and the region. You have the floor, again, 15 to 20 minutes, please.
Thank you very much. I would like to thank Nilofar Sakhi Institute, I hope I'm pronouncing well, for Defense Studies and Analysis for having me here today. It's an honor to be among such a distinguished panelist. Well, I'm going to talk about the security crisis, and I always categorize the security crisis of Afghanistan under two categories, the traditional security threats and the non-traditional security threats. I look actually at the internal aspects of security issues and the external aspect also where Afghanistan could pose to the region. With that, let me give a little bit background of to just create a platform or a frame for what I'm going to discuss today. With the collapse of Republic and the Taliban takeover, Afghanistan has entered a very new phase. And the new phase meant a lot for the people of Afghanistan and the relationship of Afghanistan with the region. The Republic is placed by the authoritative system. So there is an authoritative system in place, which is highly totalitarian and includes Taliban hardcore and old guard, filling top posts. Most of them belong to one ethnic group. There's no available positions for other ethnic groups, women and minorities. And this has created severe limitations on civil society and has raised questions about the civil and political rights of individuals, particularly women. Currently the country faces a humanitarian identity, human rights crisis with issues such as resource scarcity, irregular migration, which is causing social and political instability. Now, as the Taliban increases its stronghold and gains more territory and power throughout the country, it will become a serious transnational threat. And I will look at all the transitional elements that these security issues could raise. First and the foremost, radicalization and the emergence of new terrorist groups and armed trafficking will likely increase. And again, there are facts that will lead us towards those directions, which adding to local security threats. Further fragmentation of society, along with multiple other factors like poverty, poor governance, Taliban's atrocities, they all will add to the instability and increases the probability of insurgency in the long term. I study political violence, so I went through a number of cases. I did a research last week on traditional and non-traditional security threats, and I studied a number of case studies where when militant group come to power, what happens to the country and what happens to the internal security issues. So some of the facts that some of the issues that I'm raising here and talking about is derived from some of those data that I gathered from my research a couple of months ago. So let me first discuss a little bit about the traditional security issues or the hard security issues that the Taliban takeover could cause to Afghanistan and its region. Afghanistan traditional security threats emerge from internal security dilemma, and with the very fact that the state is controlled by a militant group and ties with a transnational terrorist organization like Al-Qaeda poses serious threats to its own security and security of the region. And there are evidence that Taliban is still having link with Al-Qaeda. There are evidence that they haven't cut ties with those groups. and with other smaller groups that I'm going to name them based on the data that I collected. And these facts highlight that, they could pose threat if they will certainly not be not settled well in a country and not recognized. As the Taliban increases its stronghold and gains more territory and power, it will be a threat of radicalization, and the new emergence of terrorist groups will emerge in the region, because it will inspire other terrorist organizations to mobilize themselves. And there will be also arms trafficking will likely increase, which adds to the local security issues. The Taliban's return to power has already inspired jihadists to rally around their global mission to expand their territorial and ideological war. And I would assume that Pakistan and Bangladesh are likely to be the first countries in the region to be affected by the Taliban's victory. The Pakistani Taliban Tehrik-e-Taliban (TTP), which has made explicit threat to attack the West in the past, will be inspired by the Afghan Taliban's victory, and we have already seen a number of evidence from the last couple of months, which they will seek to expand its areas of influence inside Pakistan across the region. The Islamist fundamentalist group in Bangladesh are particularly attracted to the Taliban's ideology and have used it to rationalize their behavior. For example, JMB, Jamaat Mujahideen in Bangladesh, they already had links with the Taliban in 1919. It's an indigenous group committed to establishing an Islamic State through violence, has long aimed to establish a Taliban-style government in Bangladesh by force. And they already had a number of statements when the Taliban took over. There were a couple of statements by JMB. The Taliban takeover in Afghanistan also encouraged jihadist groups like Al-Shabaab in Somalia, Al-Nusra in Syria, ISIS and Al-Qaeda, which are predicted to expand their outreach. Of course, we don't have evidence at this stage, but why I would see that they would further inspire them and they build their networks, and in some cases with alliances with other smaller insurgent groups. So, that's the result, that's the cause, the consequence of Taliban takeover. The aspirations of this small and big terrorist groups in the region and beyond. On the other hand, the Taliban victory may inspire new groups and create a war of attrition in parts of countries like Tajikistan that have a weak governance system and where state operation seems to have provoked some violent incident in the past. As reports highlight, again according to reports, violent extremism and insurgency exist in Tajikistan, and there are causes rooted in Tajik state-society relations that might increase the potential for violent Islamic extremism. For instance, some areas have not benefited from economic development, and grievances against the local governments are very high, and that could provide platform for the extremist or insurgent group to emerge. And if Taliban have their stronghold in the country and the region, there might be those part of Tajikistan might be influenced by the Taliban. In such a context, the Islamist group will try to undermine the government's stability and legitimacy by exerting their influence on people and creating instability. So the smaller country in the northern part of Afghanistan, Tajikistan, and Pakistan, Bangladesh, and broadly speaking, the countries in the region will be impacted once the Taliban have their strongholds in Afghanistan. On the other hand, the Taliban stronghold, what it means for the security issues inside Afghanistan. As I clearly mentioned at the beginning of my talk, that the authoritative system of the Taliban, the fact that the Taliban administration is ruled by the hardcores and no other ethnic groups are included, people don't see their participation in the political system. And there are a number of case studies around the world that when people don't see their presence, it will create identity crisis. And with the identity crisis, there are two options for the people. The one option is either people are seeing right now, the exodus of people, or they will join insurgencies, or they will create movements. Maybe that is non-violent movement. There are pockets of insurgency around the country in each part of the country. And we already have seen some pockets in the north and the other parts. But if the same whatever system, interim government the Taliban have, if the same pattern will go and they will not have an inclusive government in place, people revolt. And the revolt has different forms and different patterns, as I mentioned, but that revolt could be dangerous. As highlighted a little bit by Michael, the civil war is an option that many of the analysts are arguing inside and outside Afghanistan. And by civil war, it means that pockets of insurgency will arise. And when those pockets of insurgency arise, when the people don't see their presence in the political system. On the other hand, when the atrocities increases, there are reports that says, by the way, that the number of attacks have decreased since Taliban have taken over. There are also reports that highlights that when the security situation are better in some provinces, but the form or the kind of security threats have changed. Yes, number of attacks decreased. Yes, casualties decreased. But then there are other kinds of security issues, like people are being killed, detained. There are atrocities on the minorities. The minorities are being pushed hard on certain aspects, and there are all other kinds of social and political restrictions on the population at large, which could by itself create security issues going forward. So that is about the nature of the security concern that the country with the Taliban takeover could pose to itself and to the region. The non-traditional security issues that I have gathered from last at least 4 months of the Taliban takeover, that is very much relevant to the governance system of the Taliban, how Taliban will govern. Look, we all know with the experience of Taliban in 1990s that they did not have a successful plan for the governance system in Afghanistan. It was a failed system, and overall, from last 2.5 years of this peace process or withdrawal process, there was a lot of push to the Taliban to present their governance system or other guidelines for running the state. But actually, there wasn't nothing from the Taliban. So with that, and with the way how they have governed from last 4 months, it has shown that there are some lack of capability within the governance system of the Taliban, lack of human capability, human resource, technical people to take control of the different departments or different ministries. The distribution of resources has been an issue. The protection of law, there is no law, and the law that they have, that's interpreted differently by different parts of the country that could cause issues for the implementation. That is another issue. If we just detail down the logistics of the governance, they have failed in many aspects, and they were not able to provide a governance system throughout the country. So when the governance system fails, of course, again, that would create people to have their own, to create their own mechanism for protection. And there will be armed groups emerge, and people do all kinds of create all kinds of security measures in order to protect their own security, particularly. With that, that could cause, again, the emergence of the pockets of armed groups across the country. And that's why it adds to the security issues. And when communities are armed, when people are armed, that would be a crisis within the population. So that could further fragment the society, divide the population across lines, across ethnicity, across identity, and that would by itself create. So governance overall, governance could create a lot of lack of governance. Good governance could create a lot of security issues and can pose security threats in the long term that we see could emerge from the current authoritative system of the Taliban. The other element which I wanted to add into that could add to the security issues is local grievances. The local grievances among the population, by the way, some of these problems are inherited from the past, but again, the Taliban could further fuel this and could further add to this issue. The local grievances, as I mentioned, the Taliban lacks an inclusive policy to bring a diverse population or representation of people from different backgrounds, skill set, expertise, and ideology into the composition of the government. And they clearly highlighted, by the way, they are bringing their own loyalties. They said that it's a nature of the game. That's how they clearly said in their statement, that whoever is in the power, they will bring their own loyalties. So, I don't see any change, and I don't know, at least from what facts we have from last 4 months, I don't see that they will bring any change in the composition of their government going forward. And atrocities such as suppressing women's rights, detaining and beating journalists, warning protesters, imposing strict rules, and some are some of the major significant concerns that people have. The situation shadowed the lives of progressive men and women. So the 5 major cities, which we call progressive cities of Afghanistan, and which has been a lot of social transformation in different parts of the history. There has been social transformation in those 5 major cities. So, and most of the progressive men and women are coming from the center of the cities always, not from the rural, from the center. So what happens that, and this progressive population, they are right-based communities, intellectual communities, they are civil society activists and practitioners, and they're all around and different parts of the country. So they oppose the system once they don't see the system is working well, and that will create and they will be the source of spreading grievances among the population at large, but could reach out to the rural population because they were able to equally distribute resources or equally involve and mobilize people around the country. So that will create local grievances. On the other hand, poverty itself. With the Taliban takeover, we all know that 23, according to the WFP report, 23 million people right now are under the dire need of food. And there is a high level of starvation in the country and all kinds of other development issues and the humanitarian crises that are emerging in the country. That will add, with all the nature of the authoritative system that I highlighted, lack of inclusivity, adding with the humanitarian crisis, that will create further or add further grievances to, among people. And that will be the cause of revolt. Again, I don't know the nature of revolt, what kind of revolt that will emerge. There are different case studies that highlights different nature of revolt. At least what we see in the context of Afghanistan historically, that pockets of resistance will emerge. And that pockets of resistance might take the form of insurgency if they're not controlled well, and they might take a severe form of joining terrorism or terrorist act. That's why there is an hypothesis that Afghanistan might become once again a platform for terrorist organization to emerge and nurture themselves because of all this internal crisis that could add to the grievances of the people on one hand. On the other hand, that could add to the further marginalization of society and harboring the insurgent groups to emerge and nourish in that context. There are hypotheses about that we have to wait and see how it shapes. Now, that are about the traditional and non-traditional. Another aspect of non-traditional threat is, of course, that what I would see if Taliban will not have enough money going forward, right? The recognition is an issue. And on the other hand, they are unable to generate sources of income from the local resources. So what happens? Well, I assume, based on the reports from 1990, with the Taliban involvement in drugs and drug mafia, I assume the Taliban will turn their face to the drug sector. And they will be joining, because of, the financial gains, they will be joining the jihadist groups regionally or beyond that. Maybe that is a small, that wouldn't be a very large contribution, but that would be some contribution to sustain their regime. So for sustaining their regime, they might turn their face to another aspect or to a source of income, and that is drug and the money that they can get from the jihadist groups or individuals across the region or beyond that. So that's another thing that could strengthen ties. That aspect of their turning face, that could strengthen ties with the other jihadist groups going forward, especially if they face financial crisis and if they face crisis with sustaining their regime. What it means for countries in the region? Well, countries in the region have their security interest very clear cut. The foremost important interest of all these countries are their security, especially China, Russia, Iran. I have written a couple of papers, did research on this, 3 countries in specific: Russia, Iran, and China, and what it means for them, the Taliban takeover. Well, China has a number of mega projects in Pakistan started, and China economic expansion means a lot for it, and China does not want any kind of a regime or government in place in Afghanistan that could pose its economic interest in the region. And rise in insurgency, emergence of new insurgent groups, and from Afghanistan could certainly pose threat to Taliban, to China, a mega economic project that already a couple of them was under attack in Balochistan at some point by the insurgent groups. So that would be the first interest of China, to protect its economic projects, whatever is in the region, especially in the Pakistan area. And on the other hand, to not let any threat emerge from Pakistan. That's why, from Afghanistan. That's why we have seen that China had a relationship from last couple of years when the peace process was happening with the Taliban. Russia's immediate priorities would be to limit the risk of spillover fighting or the movement of organized extremist group into Central Asian states along Afghanistan's northern border. For me, what I would see, according to my research, that Russia has a political interest in the region, but China has an economic interest in the region. And then how they will converge and diverge this, how this interests are converging and diverging, we have to really wait and see how things will move forward with the Taliban. And Iran aim will be to stem the flood of refugees and drugs and prevent harm to the Hazara communities in Afghanistan because of the ideological interest with the Shias that Iran has. So all these countries, especially I looked at these 3 countries and their interests. So these 3 countries, they're called the global, the regional powers of the region. And what I would see going forward, because they don't want, I mean, by Taliban takeover, their security first would be under threat, and their internal issue, their internal social issue will be under threat. So what I would see that, what I actually analyzed based on the fact that I got, that they might build alliances going forward. It's kind of seems at some point impossible, especially alliance building between China and Russia. But well, let's not forget that there has been a couple of agreements, mega agreements signed, one between China and Iran in 2019, another between China and Russia. There are bilateral agreements on expanding economic and political interest of all these countries. So what I would see with this new agreements that made among these countries, I would see that they will build alliances, especially with the absence of the US and the region, and they are all competitors in the region as well. So they will build alliances to first of all mitigate the security threats that insurgent groups in the region or terrorist group in the region could pose them, and also to expand further their economic interests and political interests in the region and have their say in the region, especially now that there's a vacuum of power by the US withdrawal. I stop here and I leave it the others for the question and answer session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nilofar Sakhi. And I'm sure there are going to be a large number of questions to you also from our participants. Let me now invite the participants also that if you have any questions, please put them in the chat box so that we can go on to the question answer session immediately after we've had all the 4 presentations. There will be some time, of course. I, as the moderator, will have the first go at asking questions from all the panelists, but I would invite the participants and even the other panelists also, if they have questions or comments, please put them in the chat box. Let me now come to the third speaker, Mr. Bruce Pannier. He's a long-time journalist and correspondent covering Central Asia. He currently writes Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberties blog, Kishlok Ovozi, which means the voice of the village, if I'm not mistaken. But of course, his voice doesn't cover only the villages, it covers much broader span all over Central Asia. He appears regularly on the Majlis podcast for RFE-RL. I think those who've been following Central Asia know him and know of him very well. Prior to joining the Radio Free Europe, in 1997, Mr. Pannier worked at the Open Media Research Institute in Prague. In 1992, he led a sociological project in Central Asia sponsored by the University of Manchester and the Soros Cultural Initiative Foundation. During that time, he lived in villages in Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan. I see that Tajikistan has been left out, so maybe you still have something to do, something more to do in Central Asia. So the subject of Mr. Panier's talk is Central Asia's approach towards the Taliban-controlled Afghanistan. So while I think the other two speakers have raised doubts about the continuity of Taliban in control in Afghanistan, Mr. Pania takes it that there would be a Taliban-controlled Afghanistan and how the Central Asians would react to it or respond to it. So you have the floor, sir.
Thank you, sir. And thank you to IDSA, too, for the invitation to speak today. Yes, personally, I'm not sure about the Taliban's future, but certainly Central Asia's attitude toward Afghanistan under Taliban control this time is a little bit different, and that is the topic of my paper. The Central Asian reaction to the Taliban regaining power in Afghanistan is almost exactly the opposite of what it was 25 years ago when the Taliban first seized Kabul. Well, it's unlikely that any of the governments in Central Asia, in Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, or Uzbekistan, are happy about the Taliban gaining control again in Afghanistan. The fact is that they've been through this before, and so they're viewing it through the lens of what their experience was in the late 1990s when the Taliban were there. And I want to go over some of that ground again so that everyone gets an idea of just what it was like in Central Asia in the last half of the 1990s. When the Taliban took control of Kabul on September 26, 1996, it's really set off panic in most of Central Asia. And I say most of Central Asia because Turkmenistan, which has generally been an outlier in Central Asia, had just been recognized by the UN as a neutral country, which no one really was sure exactly what that meant. But when the Taliban took Kabul, the Turkmen made clear that one, they were not going to enter into any military alliances, and two, they were willing to talk with anybody that was in power in Afghanistan. Turkmenistan's interests in Afghanistan have always been economic and really as a transit country, not for trade with Afghanistan necessarily, but the Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India natural gas pipeline has been one of their pet projects for 25 years now. It's still unrealized, but they haven't given up on the idea at all. And in fact, later after the Turkmen had made their position clear on Afghanistan and said that they wouldn't get involved in internal affairs there, while they didn't recognize the Taliban government, and none of the Central Asian governments ever did, Turkmenistan at least allowed the Taliban to open a representative office in Ashgabat, the capital, Turkmen capital, specifically with an eye toward trying to advance the TAPI pipeline. I'm gonna return to Turkmenistan again at the end because I think that their policy in the late 1990s is actually a model for what Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Uzbekistan are doing today. Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan, as I mentioned, were close to panic in the days after the Taliban captured Kabul. They arranged a hastily arranged meeting with Russia. They sent their foreign minister, or prime minister actually, to Almaty. All of the groups, all these countries and Russia had opposed the Taliban, and they watched with growing concern as the Taliban entered Afghanistan in 1994 and made their way slowly north toward the Central Asian borders. We have to remember too that the Central Asian countries had only been independent for about 5 years when this happened, and all the region's leadership they were former members of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. They had very little knowledge of Islam. And a civil war had already broken out in Tajikistan in 1992, and it was still going on at the time. And the government forces in Tajikistan were fighting what was generally considered to be an Islamic opposition. It was much more complicated than that, but that's how the Central Asian governments tended to view this. So they had good reason to worry that there was an Islamic opposition fighting in Tajikistan, and the Taliban were making great gains in Afghanistan, often unopposed, and that this was something of the start of a wave of Islamic extremism that was going to wash over all of Central Asia. I mentioned Russia shared their concerns. They still had military bases in Tajikistan, still do. But at that time in the late 90s, they also had troops in Kyrgyzstan until 1999. So Tajikistan and Uzbekistan, which share a border with Afghanistan, were of course particularly hostile to the Taliban and helped groups in northern Afghanistan that were fighting the Taliban. The Taliban government helped the Tajik group led by Ahmad Shah Massoud. The Uzbek government helped the Uzbek group led by Abdul Rashid Dostum. The Taliban knew Tajik and Uzbek governments were helping their enemies and warned Dushanbe and Tashkent several times to stay out of Afghanistan's internal affairs. The Tajik peace accord was signed in June 1997, and as part of the deal, the opposition agreed to disarm its fighters or have them integrate into Tajikistan's armed forces. However, there were foreign fighters in the ranks of Tajikistan's opposition, including citizens of Uzbekistan. These Uzbeks were welcomed by the Tajik opposition during the war, but when peace came, there was suddenly no place for them in Tajikistan anymore. And this is important, will be important to remember as the current situation in Afghanistan develops, and I'll return to this at the very end of my talk. With the final stage of disarmament of Tajik opposition fighters set for early August 1999, some of the Uzbek group in Tajikistan chose to go into southern Kyrgyzstan, where they took a village hostage and then also took several Kyrgyz officials hostage who were sent there to negotiate. By the end of August, there were several hundred Uzbek militants in the mountains of southern Kyrgyzstan, and they declared publicly that they were the Islamic Movement of Uzbekistan, or the IMU, and their goal was to overthrow Uzbek President Islam Karimov and his government. The IMU was led by longtime opponents of Karimov, some of whom have been tried in absentia back in Uzbekistan and convicted of terrorism. The IMU fought a low-intensity campaign in Kyrgyzstan until winter came in October. Then, under a deal worked out with Kyrgyz and Tajik authorities, they were allowed to go to northern free passage to northern Afghanistan, and actually they were ferried on helicopters belonging to the Russian border guards into northern Afghanistan just to try to get rid of them. The IMU already had contacts with the Taliban. The Uzbek and Tajik governments still opposed Taliban rule in Afghanistan and were still helping out to the best of their abilities the forces that were fighting against the Taliban. So the Taliban allowed the IMU to regroup and rearm in northern Afghanistan. Then in the summer of 2000, the IMU returned to southern Kyrgyzstan and this time to southeastern Uzbekistan also. The effect was that the governments of Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, and Tajikistan were forced to divert their attention to their own internal security problems, with far less attention being paid to what was happening in Afghanistan. This experience helps to explain why the Central Asian governments are willing to talk to the Taliban now. But I'll get back to that at the end. September 11, 2001 completely changed the situation. Central Asia was one of the biggest beneficiaries of the 20-year US-led operation in Afghanistan. The immediate effect was the removal of the Taliban from the Central Asian border. The IMU was decimated in US bombing strikes in Kunduz in November 2001. The group's leader was killed, and the remnants of the IMU were forced to flee to the tribal areas of Pakistan, where most of them remained for more than 10 years. At the time the Taliban were chased from power, there was little of what today is called connectivity between Central Asia and Afghanistan. The few crossings into Afghanistan that existed dated back to the Soviet campaign in Afghanistan, and they were all closed as of September 11th, 2001. Only Tajikistan had opened an embassy in Afghanistan, and that closed after the Taliban seized Kabul. Central Asia and Afghanistan were neighbors, but they were cut off from each other as much as possible. The Central Asians could make them cut off from each other. The situation changed over the course of the next 20 years after the US operation started. Crossing points appeared on the Turkmen, Tajik, and Uzbek border. The Asian Development Bank's Central Asian Regional Economic Cooperation Program opened new links between Central Asia and Afghanistan, and later China's Belt and Road Initiative gave new impetus to the ADB projects. The Duslik or Friendship Bridge over the Amu Darya, that was the major crossing point for Soviet forces, had been closed since Dostum's forces were chased from Mazar-e-Sharif in August 1998. That was reopened. The bridge had a railway over it also, and during the Soviet time, it only reached just to the other side of Afghanistan. That railway line was extended with ADB help all the way to Mazar-e-Sharif in 2011, and the first train from China arrived outside Mazar-e-Sharif at that train station in September 2016. Turkmenistan now has two short railway lines that connect it to Afghanistan. Electricity power transmission lines have been constructed, allowing Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan to export electricity to Afghanistan, according to the Asian Development Bank. Afghanistan imports 73% of its electricity and pays some $300 million annually for this. Of the imported electricity to Afghanistan, Uzbekistan supplies about 57% of it, Iran 22%, Turkmenistan 17%, and Tajikistan 4%. Money from the United States used to pay for that electricity. Now it's unclear how the Taliban will pay for it, though they are promising to pay when the situation in Afghanistan stabilizes. And for now, the governments in Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan seem content to keep supplying electricity to ensure the Taliban have no reason to go back on their word and on keeping Central Asian militants in Afghanistan from using Afghan territory to plot attacks on Central Asia. Also, there are large projects that Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan hope can still be realized even with the Taliban in power. I already mentioned TAPI. This is Turkmen officials. Their foreign minister has already gone to Afghanistan. They've had other Taliban delegations have come to Turkmenistan to meet with officials there, and this is always the main topic on the agenda is trying to get the TAPI pipeline constructed. Even though at this point it's kind of unsure if India is still involved in this or not. But it's something that it's a pet project of the Turkmen president, Gurbanguly Berdimuhamedov. He's never given up on it, and he seems determined that this can work, and he wants that to go through right now. In Uzbekistan's case, Tashkent is hoping to construct another 500 kilovolt power line from Surkhan in Uzbekistan to Pulikumri north of Kabul. More important, Uzbekistan wants to see the railway line to Mazar-e-Sharif extended further to Kabul and then on to Peshawar. That could link up to road and railway networks in Pakistan that reach the Arabian Sea and create a new north-south trade corridor with Uzbekistan as the major hub between trade, not only from Central Asia to the Arabian Sea, but also cargo going to and from Russia and Europe to the west and China to the east and on to Pakistani ports. So with the exception of Tajikistan, which has not shown any interest in engaging with the Taliban, the other Central Asian states have adopted something resembling Turkmenistan's model of the late 1990s that I spoke about earlier. They're showing a willingness to deal with whoever is in power in Afghanistan. And it's kind of interesting that even though, again, none of them have recognized the Taliban government, but in all their official postings about dealings with Taliban representatives, they never use the word Taliban at all. They refer to the interim or acting government of Afghanistan or the authorities in Afghanistan, but they don't ever mention the word Taliban in this. The problem with Central Asia's arrangement with the Taliban is that it depends on the Taliban keeping their promise to keep foreign militants in Afghanistan from attacking their neighbors. And I was glad that previous speakers have already mentioned some of these groups who are comprised of Central Asians or formed by Central Asians but are active in Afghanistan. In the case, there are groups such as the IMU, which I mentioned, and its offshoots. The Islamic Jihad Union is one of those. Jamaat Ansarullah, we also heard about, which is mainly comprised of citizens from Tajikistan, but a lot of others. I'm not including ISK in this because they're fighting the Taliban, and the Taliban will say that they have no control over what those fighters do. But the militants from Tajikistan and Uzbekistan and some from Turkmenistan are located in northern Afghanistan, where ethnic Tajiks, ethnic Uzbeks, and ethnic Turkmen, the ethnic Turkmen of Afghanistan live. Taliban are a Pashtun movement, and mainly. And there are already reports of ethnic Turkmen and Uzbeks being forced from villages in northern Afghanistan. The Taliban really have no reason to provide sanctuary for these foreign fighters any longer. And in fact, as we saw with what happened at the end of the Tajik civil war, but the Taliban really intend to live up to their promise not to allow foreign militants to use Afghan territory, that they could come when the Taliban asked these Central Asian militants to leave the country. as the Taliban opposition asked foreign fighters, like I said, to leave Tajikistan when their peace deal was done. Now, what will these Central Asian militants do when that happens, if that happens? Try to cross into Central Asia, which would break the agreement between the Central Asian states and the Taliban. Considering the Taliban, some of these recent moves by Pashtuns anyway, to claim, the Tajiks say ethnic Tajik territory in northern Afghanistan. The Uzbeks and Turkmens say their territory in northern Afghanistan. What will happen to these Central Asian fighters all of a sudden? I mean, these people are armed, veterans of fighting. Will they side with their ethnic cousins that are in northern Afghanistan and then decide to try to push back against Taliban moves in the region? If they, like I said, they can't really leave and go back to Central Asia, that would break the deal with the Central Asian states. It seems like sooner or later, there's going to be a problem with these Central Asian militants in northern Afghanistan. Whether that's because they get chased for the country or decide to stick up for the rights of or the property of the, like I said, their own ethnic cousins up there. It seems like sooner or later there's going to be a breaking point. It's going to be hard to explain this publicly to the satisfaction of the Central Asian states or probably even the Taliban government. How do you finesse this explanation to make it sound like the Taliban haven't gone back on their word? They're saying they're in control of the situation and they got these groups, in hand, and they won't let them do anything to the neighbors. But if they attack the Taliban, then clearly this is a threat to the Taliban, and how are they going to respond to that? If the Taliban tell them to leave and they show up in Central Asia, or without, just on their own, decide that they're going to go and carry out terrorist attacks in Central Asia, this also breaks the deal and breaks, the kind of truce that the Central Asian states would have with the Taliban government at the moment. The Central Asian, for however you want to look at this, some people call it pragmatic politics. I mean, I've seen a lot of terms applied to what the Central Asian policies are toward the Taliban right now in Afghanistan. But I really do think that, it's part Turkmen policy, but it's part realizing that the infrastructure and connectivity have been developed, that the Central Asians can see past Afghanistan and see the Indian Ocean and what trade could be. And this is especially important for countries like Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan, for instance, right? The other three Central Asian states all border either Russia or China, so they can take advantage of trade links there. But Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan don't border China or Russia, and I think always their view of expanding trade and possibly their own influence in the world has always been to the south, and that means through Iran or that means through Afghanistan. So pragmatic, yes, in the way that they're trying to figure out if they can't open up some of these new trade routes, which have been started. I mentioned CARIC and Belt and Road Initiative. So they're there, and I think it also serves the Taliban purposes immediately too, because some members of the Taliban will remember what happened when Central Asia was hostile to them and was helping out their enemies. The Taliban need to pay attention to what's happening in their own country. What they don't need is a neighbor that's helping, giving aid and some kind of support to the groups that are opposing them within Afghanistan. So for now, it seems to be an amicable way of keeping from falling into any kind of problems, any kind of arguments with each other. I don't think it's sustainable in the long term. But for the moment, it's working. And as we've seen, the UN and other groups are able to ship humanitarian aid into Afghanistan through Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and even Tajikistan, even though Tajikistan doesn't talk with the Taliban and they've exchanged some harsh words, they are letting UN aid go in through there. So for now, I guess all the sides, Central Asia and Taliban, are getting what they want out of this relationship. But again, I foresee problems in the future, mainly surrounding the Central Asian militants that are still in Afghanistan and what their future is going to be. And I'll just leave it there. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Pania, for your presentation. Let me now come to the last presentation of today. That's by Dr. Irina Zvyagelskaya. She is the professor, Doctor of Science, History, and head of the Center for Middle East Studies at the Institute of World Economy and International Relations, Russian Academy of Sciences. Dr. Zvyagelskaya was earlier a Chief Research Fellow at the Institute of Oriental Studies, Russian Academy of Sciences. She was also lecturing at the Moscow State Institute of International Relations under the Foreign Ministry of Russia. Her area of expertise includes contemporary history, conflicts, international relations, and security issues in the Middle East and Central Asia. Dr. Irina Zvyagelskaya is also a member of the Russian Council for International Affairs and of the IISS. She has authored over 250 publications, including books, chapters, and articles. And you will speak on the Central Asian states versus New Afghanistan. You have the floor, madam.
Thank you. Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers of this incredible conference, and I am very pleased and honored that I was also invited as a speaker. And I would say that for me, it's a new experience because I attended conferences in India long ago, and now I hope this is a lucky return again. And as you correctly said, I'm going to speak on the Central Asian states versus New Afghanistan. First of all, I would like to say that with the Taliban returning to power again, there are no winners in Central Asia. But at the same time, we can say that some countries really believe they have a prospect for development relations with the new government in the future. Of course, if all preconditions set by international communities are met. And some countries right now look as losers because their situation became much more constrained. They have problems on the border and so on and so forth. So I would like to start with Uzbekistan because Uzbekistan has long seen Afghanistan not as a problem, but as an opportunity. You can say that it was under the United States in Afghanistan, it's true, but at the same time in Uzbekistan, they didn't exclude the chance of the Taliban coming back again. And that is why Uzbekistan was one of the few countries who started talks with Taliban in Doha. So probably in Central Asia, they were the first and the only country which started these talks. The importance of Afghanistan for Uzbekistan can be explained from different angles. First, we all know that the Central Asian states are placed in the heartland with no access to the sea. It's very important for the development of the country, for Uzbekistan and other countries, to get this access to the sea. So the project of connectivity with South Asia, which was mentioned here already not once, was one of the main projects of the Uzbekistan government. They really saw very important opportunities in constructing logistical links and railways and roads to get through Afghanistan to Pakistan, to the Pakistani ports, and thus getting at last the access to the sea, to the ocean, which is very important for them. I remember being invited to the conference in Uzbekistan just in July this year, when they discussed this issue of connectivity again. As far as I remember, there were politicians from India as well. And the main question was at that time, what will you do with the Taliban? Because now there is a new situation, whether the connectivity project will work under the new circumstances. There is no security. There are no guarantees that you can build what you want, despite the fact, as it was mentioned, a part of the railway to Mazar-e Sharif already exists, and they also continue to build a part of it to Kabul and Peshawar, but it is still under construction. So what is the future for this project? And as far as I understand, the Uzbek experts believe that they still might find some common language with the Taliban, just showing to them that such connectivity will be in the best interest of the country. They will have their own dividends, and they should only provide security. But this is a big question. As it has already been said, there are a lot of groups which are not ready to come under Taliban. The country is fragmented, the society is fragmented, and that is why it's a big question whether the Taliban, even if it wanted, can really provide security for all this construction and to make these plans possible. But still, as far as I understand, the Uzbek authorities believe that something can be done. And there was a recent visit of the foreign minister to Afghanistan, the foreign minister of Uzbekistan to Afghanistan. And it seems that the Uzbek authorities still see Afghanistan as an opportunity. But at the same time, there are very serious concerns. The first one is about radical ideas, which really know no borders. They can really cross any border. And since there are radical elements in Uzbekistan, not many of them, much more in Tajikistan, so there are concerns that these people can become again very active. They probably won't stay in the country. They will try to get to Afghanistan, but it also means that there is certain threats to the security of the Central Asian countries. What's more, this is about the armed groups on the borders. It's true that the Talibs promised not to allow extremists and radical organizations on the territory of Afghanistan, but their promises unfortunately don't cost much. And since they are not in a position to press down all the groups which exist and which are not in favor of the new authorities, it seems that probably they will try to find common language with some, but the others will be a real threat, not only to the Talibs, but also to the neighboring countries. So these two threats still exist, and they exist for Uzbekistan. Though Uzbekistan has, as you know, not a long border with Afghanistan, it's about 150 kilometers. It is very well fortified border. And here, as far as I understand, they are not waiting any surprises. So the position of Uzbekistan is, from my point of view, is much more favorable than the position of some other Central Asian countries. And I would like to come to Tajikistan because I believe that under the circumstances, Tajikistan is really a loser. Tajikistan has a very long border with Afghanistan. It is about 1,350 kilometers long, and it is not as well fortified as the border of Uzbekistan with Afghanistan. And here, Tajikistan has real problems because of the situation in the north of Afghanistan is still very unstable. There is a lot of fighting, and there are reports that there are even fightings on the borders. And the main question is who is fighting, and who are these people who are trying to concentrate on the border. On the one side, we know that the situation in Peshawar is not stable still, though the main movement against Taliban, the Taliban was pressed, but still there are some organizations which are manned mostly by the Tajiks. It seems to me that you, sir, mentioned Ansarullah, and they say that it was set up by the Tajiks, and there are mostly Tajiks. And what's more, according to the reports of the Tajik military, there are all in all some 200 Tajiks, and they know for sure that they are people from Tajikistan, who are also in the ranks of these militant organizations. Some of them are even part of the Taliban movement. And this is, it seems strange, but this is really so. So some representatives of the Tajik ethnic group, they also joined Taliban. The main concern here is that there are quite a lot of people in Tajikistan who were really quite radical. It doesn't mean that all of them are the followers of the Islamist opposition of the civil war in Tajikistan. These are new movements and new organizations. And there are some Tajiks who are, we don't know how many, of course, who are still ready to leave Tajikistan for Afghanistan to join these forces. So as far as extremist ideas are concerned, for Tajikistan, it's a real threat, because there are people who are ready to exploit these ideas, and who are ready to consume them, and who are ready either to leave Tajikistan for Afghanistan or to stay in Tajikistan with some purposes of undermining stability in the country. I would like also to say that Tajikistan is a poor country, and they have a lot of social problems there, which can also add to the radicalization of the Tajik society. It is true that Tajikistan can take advantage of the OSTO, of the Russian assistance, because there is Russian 201 base in Tajikistan, and as you know, the border was fortified recently, and there were military exercises on the border which were carried out in the framework of OSTO. And there is also Russian assistance, because it is clear that for Russia, the threat which might come from Afghanistan is a direct threat as well, because Russia is separated from Central Asia only by an open border with Kazakhstan, which is 7,000 kilometers long. It's the longest border. And practically, it means that the border which separates Russia from Afghanistan is the border between Afghanistan and Tajikistan. So it adds, in the Russian eyes, the importance of strengthening the security of Tajikistan. As for the two other countries, Turkmenistan, three other countries, Turkmenistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Kazakhstan, I would say that as far as Turkmenistan is concerned, it's true that it still accentuates its neutral position, but Turkmenistan is also interested in TP, and also is interested in this connectivity project from its own angle. And that is why I believe Tajikistan wants to keep certain ties with Afghanistan no matter what, and they provide humanitarian aid. And there was signed a couple of agreements on the energy deliveries to Afghanistan. Energy, by the way, is very important. As we know, it comes from Central Asia, and even Tajikistan, which is very much scared of what's going on in Afghanistan, also continues its export of energy to Afghanistan. Nobody knows whether these deliveries will ever be paid, but just to put some bridges to the future, I believe, they will continue this practice. As for Kyrgyzstan, I would say that Kyrgyzstan is not very active, and Kyrgyzstan practically follows the main international trends and also supports the demands to the Taliban as to the fight terrorism, drug trafficking, and strengthening security, and so on and so forth. At the same time, Kyrgyzstan believes that the total isolation of the Taliban is not productive. So they also believe that certain talks should go on. It is very short of recognition of the Taliban, but still talks and contacts should go on. And Kazakhstan also wants certain cooperation with Afghanistan, also was very active in providing humanitarian aid, and Kyrgyzstan was among the countries which provided with Afghanistan with grain, which is really very important, and it made, if I'm not mistaken now, some 25% of the total deliveries of grain coming to Afghanistan. So since we know that the humanitarian situation in Afghanistan is really very, very complicated and very bad, so the role of Kazakhstan here is very important. And I do believe that the Afghanistan authorities has to take it into consideration. So to sum up, I would like to say that the Central Asian countries still prefer to see Afghanistan not only as a threat, but some opportunity. Not all of them believe that it will be really a very important opportunity for them. Some of them are still scared, but at the same time, they do understand that probably the Taliban came, I don't know, forever, whether forever is a good word for Afghanistan, we never know what will happen, but still they came for a long time, and that is why they will have to be dealt with. Nobody is in a hurry to recognize officially the Afghan authorities, but I believe practically all countries, with an exception of Tajikistan right now, will be ready to talk to it and to have some agreements which will make the whole situation more secure. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Irina Zvyagelskaya, for your presentation also on Central Asia. I once again invite the participants to send in their questions or their comments. But to set the ball rolling, let me ask a couple of questions to our four panelists. So the first one is in terms of our first speaker, Mr. Michael Kugelman. And what you mentioned, Michael, is that you gave the three alternatives: the short-term, medium-term, and long-term. My question to you is, you said that the withdrawal and the retrenchment, it started quite some time ago, from the time of Barack Obama when he first had the surge, but then he said 2014 he's going to withdraw and so on and so forth. But Mr. Biden has done what Trump had agreed on the 28th of February. My question to you is, could the withdrawal have been done differently? You know, there have been so many comments that have been made, and that has really dented the hard power and the outlook as far as the United States is concerned. It was seen as a very sloppy, unprofessional manner in which the withdrawal took place. Could it have been done differently? Then you have mentioned in terms of short term that taking out the remaining US citizens and also humanitarian. Now, doesn't the United States also see that Afghanistan could become, even in the short term, a big source of terror? Because I remember that there was some hearing that was going on in the United States, and one of the military generals, he said that Al-Qaeda would be in a position to launch a terror attack against the United States within 6 months, and the ISKP would be in a position to launch a terror attack within a period of about a year or so. So this is very, very short term. The third question to you would be on, you said Pakistan might be willing to collaborate with the United States, either in terms of, maybe not in terms of giving a over-the-horizon action, but maybe overflights. Now, my question is, because definitely both Russia and China will be pressurizing Pakistan not really to be collaborating with the United States, definitely not in terms of providing a base. You would have seen statements from Sergei Lavrov, who has said, you know, that, and even that Mr. Putin in his meeting with Biden in June in Geneva had told him not to ask the Central Asian states and states in the region. So do you think Pakistan would be willing to collaborate, cooperate in this manner in terms of providing a base or overflight rights? Let me just mention one or two questions to Dr. Nilofar Sakhi also. That, you know, you mentioned that Pakistan and Bangladesh would be the two countries that would be most under most serious threat of these terrorist groups from Afghanistan. So my question would be, you know, everyone has been speaking about it. We from India have been talking about it, that, you know, Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan and some of the other groups are definitely going to be, you know, feel much more inspired and encouraged to act against Pakistan. So did Pakistan not see this coming? Because there was such a huge exultation and glee with which the arrival of the Taliban in Kabul was greeted. So did they not really see this happening? And my second question to you would be that, you know, you mentioned about Pakistan, you mentioned about Bangladesh, you mentioned about some of the other countries. Don't you think that what do you think about the threat possibly to India? Because we know that in Kandahar, the Jaish chief, what is his name? Masood Azhar, Maulana Masood Azhar. He'd gone to meet the head of the Taliban and asked for support for launching attacks against India in Kashmir. And there were many statements on the Pakistan television also to that extent that the Taliban has agreed to help Pakistan in getting Kashmir from India. So what do you think of the threat or danger that India might possibly face? So let me stop here the questions to the first two speakers. I see that there are some, I have some for the other two speakers, but maybe I'll come back later to that. So first, Michael, maybe you can go ahead.
Thank you, and thanks. Those are some really terrific presentations. In terms of your three questions, I'll be brief in my responses to them. The first one, could the U.S. have done the withdrawal differently and more effectively? Absolutely, yes. I think that's quite clear. when President Biden announced his decision to withdraw in April. It certainly was a controversial decision because there were many that thought it wasn't the right thing to do at the time, but many people had accepted it. But clearly, it was the execution of the withdrawal that really was botched so much to the point that, indeed, as you suggest, it did impact U.S. credibility, including with its NATO allies. And there's going to be so many books and PhD dissertations written in the coming years about what went wrong, so to speak. But clearly, at root is something that I think I mentioned in my remarks, that few, if any, people in Washington had anticipated that the Taliban would actually be able to seize power before the U.S. had actually left. And once the Taliban seized power, that produced this very chaotic response from the U.S., where it wasn't able to draw down over those last few weeks in the gradual way that it had planned to do. The U.S., of course, had that deal with the Taliban, concluded in 2020, which ensured that the Taliban would not be attacking U.S. forces on their way out, which had been the main concern for U.S. policymakers. So it had that agreement, but with the Taliban in control, that of course sparked this panic and this fear and all these people trying to leave, and that became something that the U.S. Clearly had not planned for. I think at root, one could talk about everyone that's to blame here. Pakistan's role in the war, U.S. failures over 20 years, and of course also the Afghan state and the Afghan government, successive post-Taliban governments, their failures and corruption, and so forth and so on. There's so much to it. But I think to the question about what the U.S. could have done differently, clearly what it did not anticipate at the end of the day is that there were so many weaknesses and structural deficiencies within key Afghan institutions, including the national security forces, that there was no anticipation that everything would collapse as quickly as it did. And the U.S. had seen the warning signs. You had these reports coming out from groups like the SIGAR, the Special Inspector General for Afghan Reconstruction, pointing out the fact that you had really severe levels of corruption within the Afghan military, the morale was so low, soldiers weren't getting paid, so desertions. This had been known. But clearly the U.S. was either not able to make the necessary policy adjustments or simply overlook that, hoping that it wouldn't be that bad. In terms of the question about terror safe haven, could Afghanistan become an international terror safe haven in the short term? Indeed, you're right that some officials have said it's just a matter of 6 months or a year. But clearly, there's a lot that's not known, and it's known only to those that have access to U.S. intelligence. I mean, what makes U.S. officials think we should be thinking along those short-term timeframes? As an independent outside analyst, my sense is that you're looking at a group like Al-Qaeda or Islamic State Khorasan. Sure, they're potent, and Islamic State Khorasan carries out attacks seemingly every day, but their ability for them to suddenly be able to plot and carry out attacks far away, it's unclear to me what would have to happen to allow them to strengthen their capacities in that regard so quickly. And I think that perhaps the thing to watch out for is the foreign fighter issue, which we had discussed before. If we start to see more inflows of foreign fighters from the West, including potentially from the U.S., going to Afghanistan to join up with IS, with Al-Qaeda, whatever the case may be, that would, I think, make it more likely that Afghanistan would become a place where you would have terrorists able to use Afghan soil to plot these big attacks, including those on the U.S. It's the foreign fighter issue that reigns supreme. Keeping in mind, though, that much of the 9/11 attacks were plotted and planned outside of Afghanistan, in Europe and so forth. Yes, you had the Al-Qaeda leadership in Afghanistan, but the mid-level folks and the people actually doing the operational work, they were in Germany, they were in other places in Europe, they were in the U.S. As well. To the question of Pakistan, clearly the public messaging from Pakistan is there's going to be no cooperation at all. Things are not going to be like they were in the past. With the U.S.-Pakistan relationship, of course, there's always so much that goes on covertly, and one never knows what's going to happen. It could be that the two countries agree to some type of thing. Probably not an agreement that would allow U.S. Forces to base themselves in Pakistan as in the past, but there could be some other type of agreement, intelligence sharing agreement, and it may never be made public just because it's such a sensitive issue. I do think that we can expect a formal agreement on overflight rights for the U.S. and Pakistan, just because it's been doing it for a long time. Pakistan arguably benefits as well from that type of arrangement because the main target of U.S. counterterrorism activities would be ISK, Islamic State Khorasan, and that is a group that Pakistan largely regards as a threat. And China and Russia regard that group as a major threat as well. So I don't necessarily think that China and Russia would be pressuring, urging Pakistan not to provide or extend those overflight rights to the United States. China and Russia have been working with the United States themselves through the Troika Plus arrangement. There is some scope for cooperation there, albeit on diplomatic levels. So I think that we shouldn't expect much to come from new levels of counterterrorism support with the cooperation with the U.S. and Pakistan. If there is anything substantive, it probably would not be made public. But I do think that one thing we could see happen is this formalization of this overflight rights. I'll leave it at there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Michael. Nilofar?
Yeah, in relation to Pakistan, most of the time states don't have a really clear calculation for what's going to happen after a decision that they make. Going back to the withdrawal and going back to Taliban's takeover, I think that calculation was also missing from the political process of last 2.5 years. And that's why the miscalculation actually made the Taliban to take over. That's what I see. In terms of Pakistan, I think what Pakistan thinks that Pakistan believes that's stronger in terms of the state capacity. And as compared to Afghanistan, if a group like Taliban emerged in Afghanistan because there was a fragile government, there were lots of other internal issues within the government of Afghanistan and in Afghanistan that led to the Taliban takeover. Let's not forget that as well. They were also, I always say in my other talks as well, that there were internal factors in Afghanistan which also caused the Taliban takeover from last 20 years. So that is why, and one of the internal factor was a fragile government, corruption, widespread corruption, and a very weak governance system, even from last 20 years. So Pakistan believes that Pakistan is strong enough in terms of government capacity to manage and mitigate such threats, even in the shape of TTP, if it arises, or other insurgent group if it arises in the country. So that is one of the perceptions from the Pakistan state. The confidence about its own resource and power to mitigate emerging threats that could emerge out of the Taliban's takeover and could be threat to its own security inside the country. That's, I think, what I see as a kind of a general perception that Pakistan has. In terms of India, there's a term in international relations which is called extra-state wars, and I would always see India and Pakistan relationship in Afghanistan has come under that umbrella of extra-state conflict, where you fight directly or indirectly your war in a third territory. So in terms of the Pakistan relationship to India, of course, we all know about its all computation that it has and history. I think Pakistan will use, if the Taliban will have their strongholds, and if this friendly Taliban-Pakistan relationship continues, Pakistan will use Afghanistan soil to the Taliban for anti-Indian activities. And that in the long term, if again there are ifs attached to what I say and analyze, if the relationship between the Taliban and in Pakistan goes the way it is right now, which I believe it will go, because Pakistan has invested a lot in Taliban, and Pakistan considers Taliban's victory as its own victory. And they sponsored, they trained, and they did all mechanisms since 2003 onwards to support the Taliban, and for them that's a victory. So if this relationship continues, I think yes, they will try to have whatever interest they have in India through soil, which could be a security threat to India. So that's where I see if the relationship goes the way it is. I stop here.
Thank you, Nilofar, for your response. Now, in the chat box, I have a few questions, and let me come to Bruce and Dr. Irina Zvyagelskaya. And then I'll take the question also from the chat box, which are for them. So first, to Bruce, to you is, you mentioned about this agreement that the Taliban has with the Central Asian countries, and it doesn't want to sort of, break that agreement, so to say. My question to you would be, can the Taliban be trusted? Because, all the commitments that the Taliban has made during all these discussions and negotiations over the last, since 2018, the discussions started with the United States, then they have been going around to the other countries also. And they said, we will have an inclusive government, we will safeguard the rights of women, allow the girls to study, minorities, etc. There'll be no problems. Those who have been working earlier in the government, they will not be, there'll be no vindictiveness against them or whatever, against journalists and so on and so forth. Each and every one of those commitments and promises has been broken. And when there are these meetings, whether it is the Moscow format dialogue that takes place, or when we had the meeting of the National Security Advisors in India, and all these elements were once again reiterated, then Taliban says we have already met them. We are already fulfilled all our commitments. So my question to you is, can they be trusted? The second, the question to Dr. Irina would be, we've been talking about TAPI, and Bruce, you also spoke about TAPI a great deal. And there is the question of security, of course, but there is also the question of funding. And that is also a huge question that, who is going to fund all this coming through Afghanistan, through Pakistan, and coming to India. India, in fact, the question that you raised, is India doing anything about it? India just has to receive the gas on its border in Punjab at Fazilka, when it comes from there. So India doesn't really need to do anything, but we have agreed in terms of the pricing, etc., when there was the groundbreaking ceremony in 2015 and so on and so forth. So I think as far as India's position is concerned, it's quite clear. We are ready, and we welcome this gas coming from there. But of course, the pipelines have to be made, and what you mentioned about the visit of Mr. Rashid Meredov to Afghanistan recently, the construction has not even started in Afghanistan. So the whole of Afghanistan is remaining, Pakistan is remaining, and under these circumstances, which international organizations will be willing to put in their money, will be willing to fund this? So these are my questions, but I have also from the chat box. So if you permit, I will read out these questions to Dr. Irina and to Mr. Pannier. What are the prospects of Central Asian stroke Uyghur militants operating from Afghanistan, aligning with ISK as the region engages Taliban? Another question is, what are the prospects? Okay, it's the same question. Okay, so let me first give the floor to Bruce and to Dr. Irina, and then we'll come to the other questions. We do have other questions, I'm glad to say. So we will take them after the responses from the two panelists on Central Asia. So first, Bruce, you have the floor.
Great, thank you very much. The very short answer is that no, I don't think the Taliban promises can be taken at face value. I don't see how that's even possible. And I'm sure that the Central Asian governments are aware of this also. I mean, Dr. Zvyagelskaya had mentioned that they still are conducting military exercises. Uzbekistan has conducted military exercises with Russia. They've also conducted military exercises with Russia and Tajikistan. the Collective Security Treaty Organization that Russia leads has held military exercises in Tajikistan and in Kyrgyzstan. So none of the Central Asian governments, I think, are fooled by this. What they're hoping, I think, is that maybe some momentum can be gained on this, and they can at least get some of these projects they want started or extended or whatever. But I don't think there are any illusions that the word of the Taliban is 100%. At all. They're all kind of taking their hedging their bets a little bit with that, like I said, with the military training. And I thought that Nilofar raised a good point earlier too about the Taliban and the drug trade. Previously, when Turkmenistan it took their posturing of neutrality in the late 1990s, it was also one of the main drug routes for drugs out of Afghanistan. The current president is strongly, anti-narcotics trafficking. He's generally in favor of big health. He's a former dentist and a health minister. But he doesn't have that. He didn't have the same relationship, or I don't think the same inclination for the same relationship as turning the other eye to narcotics trafficking that President Safar Murad Niyazov had, 20, 25 years ago. So this is another question too, but I don't think that the Central Asian governments believe that they have an ironclad deal with the Taliban. I think for now, what they don't want is trouble, and so they're willing to see what they can do as far as engaging with the Taliban and see how far that gets them. And quickly, as far as ISK, this is of course always a problem. With Central Asians, it's possible to characterize the Taliban as being an Afghan nationalist movement, but ISK is a totally stateless actor. And we know that there are Central Asian students, Central Asian citizens who have gone to the Middle East, to Iraq and Syria, and joined up with them. And we know that there are some that are currently in Afghanistan that are also with them. So this is really the big threat, and this is really what Russia keeps saying too, is that we can deal with the Taliban. They're telling the Central Asians we can deal with the Taliban, but the real threat is Islamic State Khorasan province. And that's the one that not just that the Central Asians are worried about, but as we heard too, that Russia is too, because of course there's millions of Central Asian migrant laborers that go to Russia every year. So how do you distinguish one Central Asian ISK militant from hundreds of thousands of other migrant laborers that are going there all the time too? So yes, this is a problem, and the ISK has carried out attacks that it claimed in southern Tajikistan already just a couple of years ago. So.
Thank you very much, Bruce. Dr. Irina?
Thank you. Your question is very much to the point. Who will be funding all these projects? Because it's obvious that these projects right now do not look realistic. As far as I understand, international organizations will be in no rush to put their money in such risky projects. There were hopes that probably China will somehow shoulder some burden of the construction, but China right now is not in a position of losing money. They even slowed down their main project of their main Silk Road project, and it is always well known. But at the same time, very much will depend on the developments inside Afghanistan. Right now, we cannot predict for how long we shall have all this fighting and instability, probably for a very long time. Then it means that the projects will remain on the paper. If not, if there will be some changes, because after all, the Taliban, though they are very special government, and of course they are not ready to be true to all their promises. They can make promises, but they are not ready to fulfill them. You're absolutely right about it. But still, there is a big question, and we don't have any answer to it, whether a terrorist organization can later on, under the circumstances, transform into a legitimate government. It's a good question, and we do not know an answer to it. True. That is why let's wait and see. let's wait and see. Nobody right now, I believe, can give answers to all questions concerning the situation in Afghanistan and around it.
Thank you very much. I think that is what international relations experts, they speculate, but then they wait and see what is going to happen in future. So I think this is a good way to go forward. I have a large number of questions in the chat box now. They have suddenly appeared when we have just about 5 minutes to go for this session to end. What I'm going to do is I'm going to read out all these questions, and then I will come in the same order that we started. First with Mr. Kugelman, then Nilofar, then Bruce, and then Dr. Irina. And then you could take just very briefly respond to those questions. So first is to Dr. Nilofar, do you envisage a period of internal bloodletting along ethnic or ideological lines in Afghanistan in which Pakistan is openly drawn in on the side of the Taliban regime in which it has invested so much? Then also, I think this is also for Nilofar. You talked about non-traditional security aspects in Afghanistan. With the emerging economic turmoil in Afghanistan, how do you see the revival of opium cultivation and the issue of drug trafficking reviving in Afghanistan, particularly and South Asian region as a whole? Then one question for Mr. Kugelman. In concrete terms, how does the US exit from Afghanistan translate into greater availability of resources, military and developmental, to deal with the competition from China? Again, for a question for Dr. Irina, given the pressures on Tajikistan and the potential presence of radical elements along that long border on the Tajik side, do you see China trying to establish a quasi-military presence in Tajikistan? Then I have a few more questions. To Michael, did US discover that competition with China was more important after deciding to quit, to exit Afghanistan? And what would, also to Michael, what would be the response of US if a terror group from Afghanistan attacks countries in South Asia? So I finished all these questions, and let me first start with Michael. Be brief, we don't have much time, but choose any question that you want to respond to. You have the floor.
Thanks. In terms of the question of what the withdrawal does in concrete terms to allow it to focus more on competition with China, I think it needs to be seen in a strategic context that the U.S. has long seen East Asia.
You're not audible. Could you speak a little louder and maybe closer to the mic, please?
My apologies. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, better.
Okay. The question about how the U.S. withdrawal allows it to better focus on competition with China. Yeah, I think that for the administration, the goal is to continue what has been a longstanding process that has bipartisan support in Washington, is to redirect away from the Middle East and Afghanistan, for that matter, and more toward the part of the world where the U.S. thinks the threat of China is most severe, and that being East Asia and Southeast Asia, because that is where U.S.-Asian treaty allies are, Japan, South Korea, and all. So I think that the idea is to finally complete this pivot, so to speak, this rebalance to Asia. And I think the idea is that by withdrawing from Afghanistan, it'll free up policy bandwidth, for one thing, as well as finances, money, because we know how much it costs for the U.S. to fight the war in Afghanistan, even when it only had a small number of troops. And certainly for the U.S., for military planners looking at the potential for flashpoints, for a conflict between China and Taiwan, I think that the U.S. wants to be in a position where it could draw on assets if it needs to that might have previously been based in in Afghanistan. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you. Nilofar?
Yeah, in relation to the first question about the possibility of Pakistan taking side of Taliban if there will be any civil war or a format of that. If there will be a civil war, I think all the countries in the region, based on the historical data that we have, all the countries in the region will try to support their own kind of a proxy inside Afghanistan. Iran has its own in the past that we have. I would see that, I mean, India support that we have seen a lot in the past, and Pakistan also Taliban. So that would be the messy situation. I wouldn't see that for a short term. I wouldn't see that happening. But if the social and political instability and crisis continue, and if civil war break up, then of course that possibility can come, that all these players in the region can have their inside actors. In terms of Pakistan engagement, Pakistan policy of engagement with Afghanistan has been very opportunistic. And Pakistan interest, that Pakistan has two interests. First, to have access to Central Asian market, and the second is to certainly mitigate the influence of India in the region and in Afghanistan. So with all this security interest and economic interest that Pakistan has, I don't see Pakistan will stay at any cost, stay connected with only one proxy as known as the Taliban. So whoever served the purpose of Pakistan going forward, Pakistan will connect and will use that actor inside Afghanistan for its own purposes, and no matter whoever that comes up. So the relationship might change with the Taliban, and the shift of action from Pakistan to other actors might happen going forward if Taliban will not apply or implement the interest of Pakistan in the region. In terms of the second non-traditional security threats, especially drug trafficking, by the way, just to mention here that Taliban has a history of banning drug also. And they have an ideological framework to say that, well, it is haram, drug is haram, and people should not, farmers should not cultivate poppy, and also that should happen. So they have a history of banning drug as well. And now with that, recently they also had some restrictions on drug cultivation. And just a couple of weeks ago, I read in the reports. But that might change, as I have said. They have also history of connecting with the drug mafia in the past. And there are reports that highlights those connections as well. So if they will not have sustainable source of income for sustaining the regime, I would see and envision, based on their previous record, that they will redirect themselves to the drug mafia or drug sector, and they will get involved in that. And yes, with that, of course, the region will be impacted, particularly Iran, Central Asian countries, and of course, all countries in the region. But I would see that because Iran provide a very safe, easy route to Europe, according to UNODC report. For the drug to pass from Afghanistan to the European countries. And for that, mostly the drug smugglers find Iranian passage as an easy passage. Therefore, Iran will be impacted a lot by that Taliban moving towards the drug feed, and that might actually create a new set of dynamics and relationship between Iran and Taliban if Taliban ever turn to drug as a source of income for sustaining their regime. I stop here. Thank you.
Thank you. Bruce?
Sorry about that. Little problems. Well, I think, the Central Asians are obviously going to be watching what's going on out there in Afghanistan. It's in their interest to do it. Again, I don't think this is sustainable for them for a long time. And I think everyone's kind of expecting that the day is going to come when something goes wrong with such deals as they have with the Taliban and promises. And so, like I said, one would hope that they could maintain a peace with them. But, even as we've heard here, it's unclear whether the Taliban's even going to be holding on to power. But I would say, the significant change is the Central Asians aren't trying to run them out at this point. So that's it.
Thank you. And Dr. Irina, you have the last word.
Thank you. Well, I don't believe that China will be interested in having some military presence in Tajikistan for two reasons. First, there is already a Russian base in Tajikistan, and actually, I don't believe there will be another one in the future. Second, it is not in line with the China's policy in Central Asia because China ensured its presence and its influence in the countries through economic tools, through economic cooperation and engagement. So this is the most important field in which China really don't have any rivals in Central Asia.
Thank you very much. I think we've had a very full discussion on this issue, but I think it still leaves many issues up in the air as has been mentioned. There are a large number of unknowns, but I think there are a large number of reports also that are coming in, to the last comment of Dr. Irina. I remember just a few weeks ago, I had seen some reports from the Tajik parliament, which said, that China has been maintaining a security presence in Tajikistan, particularly in the Gorno-Badakhshan area, just around the Wakhan corridor. They have had a police post since 2016, and they are investing about $8.5 million right now to expand that base, make it into a real base. And that would be to an extent under the control of the Chinese, because I think we have spoken about the economic interests of China in terms of the BRI, CPEC, and copper and lithium and some of the other things. But the presence also of ETIM, the East Turkestan Islamic Movement, and the threat and the danger that it poses to China in the Xinjiang region, I think that we have not been able to focus on at any great length, basically because of the paucity of time. But that having been said, let me not try to sum up this discussion, because I think we have had a very broad-based discussion, starting from the perspective of starting with the United States, then traditional, non-traditional threats as far as Afghanistan, the internal situation is concerned, the impact on the region, and then particularly Central Asia, because when you are talking about Central Asia, of course, we cannot discuss it without looking at it from the perspective of Russia, because whether it is security or it is the passage of drugs from northern part of Afghanistan through Tajikistan to Russia and to Europe. So that is also something that worries Russia a great deal. And of course, refugees, because as was mentioned by one of the speakers, there are open borders. I think, Dr. Irina, you mentioned the open borders between the Central Asian countries and Russia. And of course, three of these Central Asian countries, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan, they are members of CSTO. So there is that legal requirement also on Russia to protect the security and sovereignty. And of course, Russia has the largest base anywhere in the world, 201 in Tajikistan, and it also has a base and presence in Kyrgyzstan. So I think there is all the countries, while we might have expected around end August or beginning September, that a number of countries might start recognizing, giving political recognition, diplomatic recognition to Afghanistan, but that has not happened for a variety of reasons. So I think all the countries are going forward in a very circumspect manner, taking small steps, seeing how things evolve. So maybe we will need to wait for some more time to see how the whole situation pans out. So with these words, let me first of all thank the Director General of MP-IDSA, Ambassador Sajjanhar, his team for putting this together, and of course all the panelists for sharing their thoughts, for giving their time, and all the participants who have been here in India. It is not a very early hour, we are late into the evening, but all of them have stayed with us, so I thank them. And I'm sure IDSA will continue, MP-IDSA will continue to organize such discussions so that we can share our thoughts and continue to enrich ourselves. Thank you very much. Now I give the floor to the anchor, Sindhu Dinesh, for some organizational announcement.
Thank you, Chair, and all the speakers. This was indeed a highly engaging and erudite discussion. We have our DG Ambassador Shenoy with us. So would you like to say a few words on the session?
No, I'd simply like to thank the chair, Ambassador Ashok Sajjanhar, and all the esteemed panelists for giving us such wonderful insights and for enriching and deepening our understanding of the current challenges that are before us with regard to Afghanistan. And may I also remind you, Sindhu, to tell everyone that the discussion continues tomorrow. So please kindly request everyone to log in. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, sir. I'm sure you would all agree that we've had a very good first day of the conference. Let us carry it forward tomorrow at 10 a.m. IST. I request you all to kindly log in 30 minutes earlier. Thank you for your participation today. Wishing you a good day and evening ahead. Thank you.